Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our career panel. Today we have Christine and Mosin here to join us, and they're going to talk about careers in government and in transportation. So Christine is our oldest daughter, and some of you guys have met her before. And so I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and you want to go ahead?
Hello, everybody. Good to see you. Even in this sort of weird time, it would be much more fun if we could see each other in person. Thank you for having us. I think I met some of you, but I currently work for an organization called Airlines for America. We represent all the major airlines here in Washington, D.C., and do some advocacy work for sort of the priorities. But my background is both in transportation. I started working in the airline industry. I spent some time working both at airports and I actually worked at the Port of Long Beach, which is a seaport. And then I most recently, before this, had worked on Capitol Hill on transportation issues, both in the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives as a staffer for various members of Congress. And that's where I met Mosin here, who still currently works on Capitol Hill in transportation. Has worked there for a few years, but has also worked in various roles at the federal government. He's a lawyer, has worked in the law firm, and started his career in the intelligence world. So he has a vast background. So we're excited to share a little bit about what we do and sort of how the different things that we worked on in college led us or started us on some of these paths. Mosin, do you want to self-introduce? I gave you
Absolutely. Hi. Yeah, my name is Mosin, and as Christine mentioned, I work on Capitol Hill. Specifically, I work for Congressman Peter DeFazio. He's a Democrat from Oregon, and he's the chairman of the House Transportation Committee. So I'm his chief counsel on that committee, which my job is basically to make sure that everything in terms of our committee work runs on time. So anytime you happen to see on the news a congressman asking questions of witnesses, of people at a long desk, you know, they're yelling at them. They're really trying to get to the bottom of a particular issue. That all happens on committees on Capitol Hill, specifically with hearings. So my job is to sort of make sure that the nuts and bolts of committee work, including these hearings, when we work on legislation that eventually makes its way through the House and Senate, things like that, that goes smoothly. I've worked in different parts of government here in Washington, D.C. I actually happen to grow up in Northern Virginia, not too far away from Washington. So this is home. I've worked in the executive branch for the Department of Transportation prior to, so I'm a lawyer. So I've worked at a law firm before, but prior to law school, I was also an intelligence officer, which sounds more exciting than it was. I was basically doing my part to protect our country from my desk, one email at a time, but it was a lot of fun to do that and to work with our men and women in uniform. I was a civilian at the time. And I'm happy to talk to you about sort of what brought me here. Definitely learned a lot of lessons along the way. I can safely say that nothing went according to plan, but I'm really blessed to be here and looking forward to talking with all of you and answering your questions.
And I don't want to oversimplify too much of what you do right now, Mosin, but every time I watch Schoolhouse Rocks, like on Capitol Hill, and the process that the bill goes through, I think it's a good representation of sort of all of the work that goes into making a public law. And it's everything from really big stuff, you know, to some smaller stuff that we don't even think about in terms of how big a size of a seat on an airplane should be or something like that.
Absolutely. No, there's so many issues that you know we tackle on Capitol Hill that we need to continue tackling on Capitol Hill. And I wish it was as simple as just putting it on paper and just passing it through, but there's a lot of work that goes into it. And it's not just from folks on Capitol Hill, it's folks outside Capitol Hill, including Christine, who, my former colleague, but now on the outside, but still very much involved in how our process on Capitol Hill works. So it takes more than a village, it takes a capital.
So can you all give your educational background?
Mohsen, go for it.
Sure. After high school, I went to college. Like I said, I grew up in Virginia, so I went to UVA, University of Virginia, and I studied foreign affairs and history. I always had a sense that I wanted to go to law school, and I was very much interested in politics and especially at the time, international relations. And that after college, not that I was tired, but I felt like before I go to law school, it would be a good idea to get some practical experience. And so I ended up spending 1 year as a paralegal with the Federal Trade Commission, where I learned about what it's like to be a lawyer. And just as I was about to go to law school, the Iraq War had started in 2003, and I kind of wanted to be a part of the action somehow. And so I decided to delay law school and ended up applying for a job with an intelligence agency. And that's where I ended up going for about 2 years. And that was a really rewarding experience, which I can get more into later. And then after that, I ultimately went to law school. I graduated from the University of Virginia School of Law. So again, was able to go back to UVA, and just a big fan of Charlottesville. So that's in a nutshell my educational background.
I graduated from high school in Sugar Land, Clements High School, and then I went to school in Boston. I went to Boston University. I studied finance in the business school, and I graduated during the last economic crisis in 2009 with a finance degree, which was a very difficult time to find any sort of job. The financial sector was not hiring. But I had always been interested in transportation and just sort of the movement of people and goods. And so I got a job. I'd done several internships when I was in college. I did one in the oil and gas industry, and then I studied abroad between my sophomore and junior year in London. And I worked at the sorry, my son is joining us. I worked at the London Underground, which is the subway system in London. And then between my sophomore and junior year, then my junior year, I interned at Continental Airlines. That, please. Sorry. And then I was fortunate enough when I graduated that I got a full-time offer with Continental Airlines. And so I started there. After a few years working with them in the airline industry, I decided I wanted to go graduate school as well and do a little bit more public sector work. I explored law school. So I had a different conclusion than Mohsen. I decided it would not be the right fit for me. I'm not a big writer. And so I ended up going to study urban planning at the University of Southern California and have a degree in urban planning, which is a field that I didn't know much about before exploring grad school, but it's a lot to do with sort of how cities work, how communities work, and how you put together all the various private sectors and public sectors in order to build sort of successful communities. And so that was fascinating and sort of led me on this path of public service, which brought me ultimately to Capitol Hill.
Awesome. So are you able, Christine, you want to do some questioning of Mohsen?
Yeah. Mohsen, I might throw you a question. Go get a quick swig of juice for Jamie and okay. I think it would be helpful. I think we've answered if you could talk a little bit about the pieces of your job that you find the most rewarding day to day. I mean, I think just even what you do day to day, what a typical it's not an 8 to 5 job, but what it looks like and sort of what pieces of it you enjoy the most and maybe what pieces of it are the most frustrating.
Of course. I guess let me just take a step back real quick, sort of just real quick, why I'm at where I'm at right now. You know, for me, so my parents are immigrants. They came here in the 70s. So I'm first generation here in this country. And, you know, my parents, you know, would watch the news every night. I mean, they were interested in politics in the sense that they wanted to stay informed. But I think for them, it was just more about, you know, being in this country and trying to make a better life for me and my brother and sister. And the focus was always, you know, try to get a good education, try to get a good steady job. But, you know, when I would sit and when I would watch the news with my parents, I just, I don't know, it was just really exciting to me seeing these folks on television talking about problems that needed to be fixed in America. Sadly, a lot of those same problems still exist, but, you know, I felt like at a pretty early age, I saw that there was a place to go where you could try to tackle these problems. Um, so that was always in the back of my mind in terms of becoming active in political work. So fast forward to today, you know, as you get older and as you know, get more experience or you get more experience in this area, you realize that, you know, it's more than, like I said earlier, just writing a bill and going from there. And so coming to Capitol Hill in my job right now, I realized that there's a process and it has to be organized. You have 435 members of Congress in the House, you have 100 in the Senate. So that's 535 individuals with their own ideas, their own priorities, their own conclusions on what's best for this country, what's best for their district, what's best for their voters. And so really the goal is to try for all of us to come together to a set of ideas that we can all agree on. So where my role comes in is to work with a really talented team of lawyers, of professionals, of young people, really. I mean, as interns starting at age 18, you know, all the way up, to try to write legislation that that reflects what our members of Congress feel are solutions to problems in this country. And then once we get that, to write that legislation, you have to have hearings to hear from people who are dealing with these problems or who are involved in these industries. So you gather information, you talk to folks on the phone, through email, they come in and meet with you, and you want to have an open door for that. So as you gather this information, you start getting your ideas and you start putting it on paper. And then, like I said, it's got to go through a process. You'll have something that's called a markup, where the legislation is considered by the members. Members have a chance to revise it, to put other ideas into it, and then you just keep going back and forth until finally you have it all there. You hopefully vote it out of committee, which means that you approve it, and then it goes to the House floor, and then there. You know, my role is to, you know, if it's a bill that comes out of our committee, manage it on the House floor, making sure that members I'm a Democrat, so members on our side have a chance to speak to it, making sure that's effectively managed on the floor. Eventually it gets a vote, it makes its way to the Senate does its thing, and then if they do something that's slightly different, then the House and the Senate have to negotiate. So then part of my role is to help facilitate that with our committee, you know, making sure that people have a chance to, again, argue their viewpoint with the senators, and again, hopefully get to a good place so that it can pass the House again, pass the Senate again, and then hopefully, if it's a good idea, the president will sign it. So it's really just being involved in that sort of day-to-day process. And it might sound like a lot, but at the end of the day, what's rewarding about it is that, you know, you have a chance to hopefully address a problem that needs fixing. And that's just the legislative side. Sometimes part of my job is working with our staff to just write letters to agencies, to the Department of Transportation, for example, to the Federal Aviation Administration, you know, we're seeing these problems. We want to make sure consumers are being heard. there's a huge investigation our committee is currently doing related to the crashes in Ethiopia and Indonesia involving Boeing aircraft that you've probably seen or read about. We're involved in that. So it's really just anything and everything to try to address the problems that our chairman feels like needs to be addressed in this country.
So Mohsen, in the transportation committee, infrastructure and transportation, what is that transportation? Is it just airline? What does infrastructure mean?
Sure.
All of that.
Good question, and that's certainly a definition that keeps broadening in Washington. But at least for our committee, it's pretty much every mode of transportation. So your subways, your trains, your planes, not automobiles. That's another committee, but it's really airplanes, trains, subways. We also handle the maritime space. So ports are also part of our committee. But actually, even beyond transportation, we also have disaster response. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is also part of our committee. And then we also deal with government buildings. The General Services Administration, which is in charge of all government buildings, including government buildings in Houston, that's also part of our committee. So it's a pretty broad, what we call jurisdiction. In other words, anything that touches those areas of transportation, infrastructure, emergency management, public buildings, that our committee is basically in charge of oversight over those industries, over those agencies as well.
I think too, sometimes it sounds kind of boring, right? You're like potholes and whatever, but the thing that I think everybody appreciates is that's something that every single American deals with every single day. It's your way to get to school. It's your way to get to work. It's what makes your community have, access to various businesses and job opportunities. And so one of the things that attracted me to that, and especially from the public sector perspective, is while sometimes it's boring, right? You're not necessarily doing immigration law or working on the coronavirus, well, we are working on the coronavirus response in our own way, but I think it's everyday things that impact everyday Americans, and it's small things that add up to have a really big difference and make a big difference in people's quality of life, and making sure that across communities in the country that you have the same access and the same resources, because it's public resources. And I think that's a really overlooked but a very cool part of the committee's work.
Yeah. Now, there was a former chairman of the committee, and I'll probably get the quote wrong, but he said something to the effect of, "There's no Democratic roads or Republican roads. We all have to walk over them, drive over them." And so, and that's what's nice about our committee. It's traditionally a lot more bipartisan. In other words, that Democrats and Republicans generally tend to get along pretty well and generally can get to a good place on finding solutions to issues affecting our committee. That can't always be said about all parts of Washington these days, but we do a pretty decent job trying to keep things bipartisan.
So do you go and talk to, so our representative out here, would you go and talk to them and say, hey, these are issues we find, or do they come and talk to you and say, these are issues and can you get a bill together for that?
Yeah. Both, really. We primarily deal with members that are on our committee. We have 67 members of the House total, Republicans and Democrats on our committee, 37 Democrat and 30 Republican.
Member from Texas.
Exactly, a number of them are from Texas, and they are not shy. Christine's job when we used to work together on the committee was in many ways to try to hear from these members, to reach out to these members, and to make sure that the committee and the chairman were listening to them, and we're making sure that their priorities were being considered in our broader portfolio of ideas. So sometimes they come to us, sometimes we come to them. but a lot of it also has to do with, you know, if a member comes to us, it's usually a problem that's affecting their district, their voters. And it turns out that sometimes those issues are also affecting members of Congress in their districts as well too. So sometimes you'll end up having groups of congressmen or a coalition of congressmen that'll come to us. Sometimes it could be all the congressmen in a particular state. You know, we call it here a delegation. So the Texas delegation, every member of the Texas delegation could come to us and say, look, you really need to address, you know, this with our roads or this with our airports. And then, you know, certainly we'll hear them out, and you know, assuming our chairman agrees, then yeah, we'll work together to come up with legislation. Sometimes they'll write it on their own. Sometimes we'll write it for them. And then, you know, the process goes from there.
And I think too, this is one of the things, if you don't mind, the students but really all said, you know, just people in this country, I think it's pretty remarkable to see on Capitol Hill the influence that you actually have with your elected official. I don't think I really understood that until I worked on Capitol Hill. And you don't have to be anything other than a constituent, right? To really have a voice. And so from everything in terms of if you're having trouble with an agency or having trouble trying to get a drive passport or whatever, to bigger issues, you know, you think it's unfair that something happened to you and you don't understand why the government isn't doing a better job of preventing that from happening. And the number of constituents who come in and talk to the members of Congress and how much they really value that input in everything that they do. It's pretty impressive to see. And I think Mos and I both have seen some remarkable stories of people who they have full-time jobs, right? They're teachers and they're, you know, they do they have families and they're just sort of members of the community, yet that by talking to the congressman, or congresswoman, they really make a big difference by raising certain issues. So it's cool to see, even if you don't go into government. I think just understanding that process exists and literally going on their website and filling out a form actually means a lot to them.
You know, that's a good point. Just to elaborate further, I felt like growing up, whatever I saw on TV, that's how it was. And especially today, I mean, there's just a lot of noise. There's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of arguing. It's not really like that behind the scenes. You know, I wish this part could be seen more in public, but generally the members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, do get along. You know, I mean, sadly, you know, our politics is what it is today, but you know, you as high school students, I mean, your parents, your community, you do have a voice. I mean, that's their job. They're here to represent your voice, but they're not going to do an effective job representing your voice if you're not talking to them, if you're not reaching out to them. So whether it's an email, a letter, a phone call, or just even stopping by their office, whether it's in the district or in DC, you know, their job is to listen to you. And then if they're not listening to you, well, you keep that in mind in November, especially when you turn 18. And then they'll definitely listen to you then. So just always remember that, you know, what you see on TV is not 100% true. And you know, make sure you get your voice heard.
I'm going to ask you two different things. One is there's a lot of committees. You're one committee. How many total committees are there in the House?
Oh, you stumped me there. It's
you should know. Yeah.
There's definitely over a dozen, I think.
I'm gonna help Mos in like a little bit. I think there's sort of like three ways to view, and maybe there's more ways to view the committees. There's authorizing committees, which is what Mosin and I used to work on, where you are providing authorization for the federal government to do something. And then there are appropriations committees in which you are giving federal money to those programs. So Mosin might say that the federal highway program should exist and it should have, or his committee would say, and it should have this much money. It's eligible for up to this much money, you know, $1 trillion or whatever it is. And then the appropriations committee, this is like a checks and balances thing that you learn about in government too. then says, okay, if they're allowed $1 trillion, we agree that they can have 800 billion. And they each year give that money. They make those decisions about how much each, and sometimes how it's divided. They work with Mosin's committee on how it's divided. And then you have an oversight committee in which there's a group of lawmakers who are checking that all of these programs and processes, both on the Capitol Hill, but also within the federal government and the various, CDC with all this pandemic stuff and others are doing the right things, and that they're following the intent and what's good for the American people.
No, that's a good description, and like I said, it's dozens of, if you count the House and the Senate total, it's a lot. And again, they touch every aspect of American society and industry. So you have transportation, where I'm at. In the House, you have energy and commerce, which deals with what you're probably familiar with in Houston with the oil industry and the energy industry, but they also deal with cars, and even though it's not reflected in the name, they also deal with healthcare, all things healthcare. You have the House Committee on Foreign Relations, which deals with our country's foreign policy. You have the House Homeland Security Committee, which deals with all things homeland. You have the Small Business Committee, which with everything that's going on right now with COVID and loans to small businesses, they've been very busy. They've been very active on that. So it's, if you can think of an industry in this country, there is a committee for it.
You also have, probably since everyone here has been watching the news in the past 6 months, and it seems like old news now, the exact same committees where the various investigations and the impeachment investigations were going on, whether in intelligence or in the Judiciary Committee, that's no different. The content and the substance is different, but no different than the work Mosin does. They just happen to get a lot of hours on TV because of the profile nature of what they were doing. But that also, those are House committees that were doing those work, and so that's another way you can be in government, a different angle to it, or in the Hill.
So I'm going to take you back to when you first introduced yourself, and you mentioned that you had a job as an intelligence officer. Yeah. I'm not really sure if you can talk about that since it's intelligence, but what is the process if you wanted to be in intelligence of some kind? What do you have to do, and is it like on TV, like NCIS or whatever? You're out there, or what is it like? What is that?
Right. No, and it definitely wasn't like that for me. Like I said, I was at a desk, one email at a time. But it was, for me, like I said, I studied international relations in college. So that's where I thought I wanted, my career to go. And this is what I meant earlier about you can't always plan for these things, but, it's always a blessing where you end up. But I, so, and 9/11 had happened while I was in college, and there was just so much going around me. And so, as I mentioned, my parents are immigrants; they're from Pakistan. I'm Muslim. I grew up Muslim in this country, and there was all this stuff being, post 9/11, certain misconceptions, and I just, you have two choices at that point. You're on the outside complaining, or you kind of go in and see if you can be part of changing the system within. And so that's what I did. I really had no idea, really no guidance. So for me, I just, Google was maybe 3-4 years old at the time, but I just started Googling, and eventually, saw the websites, specifically the employment websites for a bunch of these agencies. And I just put a resume together and I just applied, and one of them worked out. And my job was really, everything I learned in college in terms of international relations, but also just writing and reading and analyzing. That was all kind of brought to the front in the job I had. Specifically, well, I mean, I can't get into too many specifics, but again, there was a lot going on in the world at the time: the Iraq War, the war on terrorism. So being involved in that, and I would be given a number of countries to sort of follow, and really just try to do my job to sort of explain for our decision makers, which for me were our military heads, and then folks in the Department of Defense. This is what we're seeing. This is what you should know, so that they had all the facts they needed to make their decisions. So a lot of it was writing, a lot of it was briefing, but ultimately it was taking all the information that was coming to us from people who were doing the exciting stuff in these countries and kind of putting it all together in a way that was clearly explained to our generals, our admirals, and ultimately our secretaries and assistant secretaries of defense. And they made the decisions based on it.
And did you have to get a background check to be able to do that?
Definitely had to go through a security clearance process, which took a couple of months. And look, I mean, it's actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, you know, sometimes you make decisions at age 16, at age 18, at age 20 that you don't realize might come up in an employment interview years later. And look, I'm not saying that you need to, you know, plan for everything in that sense, but definitely try to make good choices as you go through high school and college, because you never know when a couple of bad choices might come back to you. Maybe not at that moment, but it could come back to you 5 years later in a job interview or a security clearance process. So.
And I think too, not to be too lectury on this, because I think we all grow up in this weird world now where we're being recorded on videos and all this all the time. Yeah. But even in the world of politics, I mean, you see this all the time with people on Twitter and people with videos and everything. It's just sort of, you guys, I'm sure, experience it also just in your high school and college lives in a way that even Mohsen and I 10 years, 15 years ago are not familiar with. But it is something that is always top of mind to us, because a lot of people in public facing roles as well encounter some of that stuff. And so just always having again, not to sound too lectury, but just it's one of those things that I think more than ever it's really it's the forefront of a lot of what we do, and it unfortunately plays into a lot of what you do, even if it has nothing to do with the substance of what you're working on.
So if somebody wanted to get into a government job, or you know, whether they work in the House or the Senate or something in Washington, D.C., what would you say their path should be, or what advice would you give them to do that?
Sure. Well, I would say, you know, first and foremost, do your homework, work hard in school, because you know that all comes into play as you apply for things. Start local. You know, you in Houston and Sugar Land and Katy. I know a little bit about your geography. My wife has some relatives in your area. So, but get active in your local council, your local board meetings, because that's all experience that a future state senator or a member of the Texas House, and then ultimately a member of Congress will see that, okay, this person is serious. This person is interested in public service and has demonstrated a background in it. Get active in campaigns. It's election year. Go volunteer. You know, find a candidate that you agree with or you're interested in. Trust me, they'll put you to work. You know, whether it's making phone calls, make sure people go out to vote, whether it's stuffing envelopes and sending out mailers with their positions. All that. I mean, these are all building blocks to try to get you to Washington, D.C. So definitely start local, but also don't be afraid to think big as well. Like I said, with the intelligence job, I just, I Googled it, I applied, it took a couple of months, but it worked out. So if you have, if you're showing that you're committed to public service, you're a member of Congress, specifically your member of Congress, but also other members of Congress, you don't have to just work for the person who represents you in your district, but they'll see that. And then, you know, it can take you from there. And look, it's not easy. I mean, I'll be honest, you know, when I had a really tough time getting an internship on Capitol Hill in college. My first job on Capitol Hill was not until I was 33. So it can take a while, but if you're interested and you're committed, I promise you, you'll get there. And I mean, I just didn't give up. I still have a folder in my Gmail of every email I sent to try to get a job on Capitol Hill. Some of them are, by the way, my current colleagues. So it's really funny how that works. But just be persistent. Don't give up. I didn't get a Capitol Hill internship, but I worked for the chairman of my local county. So that showed some commitment to public service. Actually in college, I was able to get a White House internship. So while not on the legislative side, I was able to do something on the executive branch. And again, these are all things that were reflected in my resume. So start in your community for sure, especially since you're in high school right now. That's easy to do. And those are just very easy bullet points for your resume. And I promise you that those are going to be the building blocks that'll get you to Washington, D.C. if that's what you want to do.
I think too, everyone talks all the time, I think they do, about sort of the importance of your network and connecting with people and having conversations. I think especially in our slice of the world, but it goes everywhere, just reaching out to people and asking to talk to them. I know it's sometimes intimidating, but I think asking for an informational interview, you guys are so lucky. You can ask, and you're in high school and college, you can say, can I shadow you for a day? Do you have 30, 45 minutes that I can just ask? Do you have 10 minutes that I can just ask you a few questions about what you do? People really value that. And I think then following up with it, thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm really interested. People will remember that. And truthfully, as Mosin mentioned too, you are in such a unique position being able to apply for internships, even just offering to go into if you are interested in working for a member of Congress in their district office, you can, call up and say, do you have any positions available, even if it's part-time, or I come in for a few hours in the morning before I go to a job and then that I need to make money or whatever it is. I think they're really interested in engaging with folks in high school and college, and you should never be afraid to Mosin's point. You just have to put yourself out there, and it's sometimes just a numbers game, right? The more times you do it, one of them's gonna stick.
That's right. That's right. The chairman that I worked for in college, in the county that I grew up in, he says that the only reason that he even interviewed me was he had never actually received an email from a college student interested in something like this. So, I mean, you just never know. It's probably a little more common today, but so just there's no harm in just shooting those darts until it hits the bullseye, because it will happen. It just might take some time. And to Christine's point on networking, I feel like networking, there's a good connotation and a bad connotation. The bad connotation is that, oh, it's just somebody who's just trying to use you to get somewhere. But the reality is if you do good work at any particular job that you're in, if you're doing good work in your school, your network is also your teacher who's going to write you a recommendation. It's going to be your future boss who sees that you're doing good work. Maybe that boss knows somebody, or that boss is just so respected that their recommendation carries weight. So just make sure that wherever you are in life, again, right now, your students, just work hard, keep your teachers happy and make them proud. That's going to take you to the next level in college. As you get internships, as you get jobs, keep your bosses happy. No job is too small. Whatever they tell you to do, just do it. In terms of work, and it's going to be reflected in where you end up, because these are your future recommenders, basically.
So y'all both have worked at some very cool jobs around the country. Have you ever been just starstruck, or like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm getting to talk to somebody and I get to work on this fabulous thing?
Christine?
I worked for the Democratic Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, which was pretty, I thought, high profile. I was never starstruck by him. The only person I have to say I was really starstruck by, and that's not because he doesn't deserve to be starstruck. I think just working for somebody as your boss, you don't really have time to take it in. But I was actually on the House floor, I think, with you, Mohsen, and somehow the Committee on Infrastructure and Transportation was in charge of running the bill when President Trump, was it last year, overrode or vetoed the bill for money for the border wall. Sorry, we had in the House of Representatives an override vote to override his veto, which is very unusual. It's a very sort of, it doesn't happen that often. It's an unusual and exciting thing to work on. And so while not usually our issues on the border wall and other things, we were down on the floor and I was helping, Mohsen was managing the bill and managing the members voting and making sure they were talking. And I was assisting, and John Lewis, the civil rights, just famous man, was down there to speak on the veto override. And I had to go up to him and tell him he was the next one to speak. And I nearly had tears meeting him. I didn't even talk to him for 10 seconds, but he was just the kindest, most amazing person. And to meet him in person on the House floor in sort of a historic vote like that was just, I have chills thinking about it.
No, absolutely. It's I always remind myself that it was so hard to get here. So I always remain starstruck. Every day you come across politicians and just walking in the hallway, Republican, Democrat, somebody you saw on TV, or somebody like, as Christine said, John Lewis, who you've grown up seeing, or reading about. With John Lewis, reading about in school. So that was just absolutely amazing. But then there's also who these politicians meet with. There'll be times where movie stars will come through,
Bono's on the Hill a lot, and
right.
and stuff, because they do all these humanitarian things.
Yeah. George Clooney's wife. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name. But yeah, that's right. She was there. Just in our cafeteria. It was.
I remember after the Olympics, Simone Biles, y'all's hometown hero, was up for something, and there was just crowds all around her, and people find her in the cafeteria and stuff. Right. She's so small, trying to find her.
No, absolutely. It's just, it's really, I think you shouldn't work on Capitol Hill if you still can't pinch yourself that you're here, if that makes sense, because it's such an amazing opportunity.
So I know you guys work insane hours. So what's the best part of your job and what's the worst part of your job? If you could just, a word or two about that.
Mm-hmm. You want to take that one?
So I think the best part of the job is when you do something, when you get, big or small, kind of these bills across the finish line. For me, I'm working on the advocacy side, which is a fine word to call a lobbyist. But and so one of the big things we did in the past couple of months is work really hard to ensure that there was resources so airline employees didn't lose their jobs in the coronavirus pandemic, and keeping them on payroll. And it was a really just demanding, tough 24-hour day, working with Mohsen and other people to see how we could make that happen. And to have the bill become law and know that people weren't going to be laid off is just, it's incredibly rewarding. I think the flip side of that, and parts of it that are less fun, is that doesn't always happen, right? You spend a lot of time on something and you might be in a worse position than you were before. You might have created more problems or less consensus, and I think that can get frustrating at times. And some of this stuff takes a long time. Like if you look at the healthcare bill, sometimes it's decades in the making, right? Things can happen really quickly, and they can take, agree with it or not on politics, the tax reform bill of 2017, right? They hadn't done one in decades. That's just decades and decades of work to happen. So I don't know, Mohsen, that's I don't mean it as a fluff answer, but.
No, it's I would say the best part of the job for me is being in the building, knowing that so many folks have come before me, you know, historical members of Congress. You know, nobody remembers their staffers per se, but just knowing that you're walking in a place that so many people have sort of come before you.
That's not true. Mohsen's name has been mentioned on the Senate floor for bills he's passed. He's being very humble right now.
I mean, just things like that. I mean, actually, that was a cool, yeah, that was a great experience. Just hearing your name pronounced there. I would say the hardest part of the job is, and this is not something that maybe I would have said 10 years ago because I didn't have kids at the time, but you know, being married and having 2 little kids, yeah, the hours can be long, and the job can definitely be pretty demanding. I mean, again, there's a lot of weighty issues that you're dealing with. And so sometimes it does affect the amount of time that I can spend with my wife and kids and my parents and my siblings. So there is a bit of a trade-off at times with that. So that's probably the hardest part, I would say.
I have one other question. Many of our students are immigrants, come from immigrant families, and they often their parents say, "Oh, you should be a doctor or a lawyer," or you did end up in law, but when you first went to college, you didn't necessarily go to be a doctor or an engineer. And so how did you navigate that conversation with your parents to say it's, you know, like, I'll be okay. I can get a job.
No, look, let me tell you, my parents wanted me to be a doctor. I mean, they loved the fact that I was interested in politics, but they didn't think of that as a career. And for them, no, you had to be professional. And again, it you know, depending on which countries, you know, you're from, your parents are from, there's just certain professions that are really held up. And at least my parents are from Pakistan, so yeah, doctor. I mean, that's what it's got to be. And that was tough because, you know, I mean, I didn't mind my science classes, but I wasn't as enthusiastic about it as I was about my history classes or my English classes. And so I think it's just one of those things like, look, number one, always be respectful of your parents. You know, they're working hard for you. So you hear them out, but I think the best thing you can do is to show them that you can be good at this other thing that you're thinking of. So in my case, in high school, you know, my parents really wanted me to volunteer at the hospital and do these things, but I became really active in Model UN, and I would have them come to our conferences, and you know, they would see like, okay, he's actually enjoying this. I enjoyed the public speaking part of it. I enjoyed getting smart on the issues for a particular country that I was representing. And I think slowly but surely over time, they realized, okay, you know what? As long as, you know, he's showing that he's serious about it. And that's, I think, the best thing. You just got to demonstrate seriousness. If you want to be a lawyer, be serious about it. If you want to be an engineer, be serious about it. If you want to go into business, if you want to be a Broadway dancer, just be serious about it. And as long as you show your parents that, you know, like, it might not be what you envision, but it is something that in this country, you know, can lead me to success, can lead me to stability, because that's what our parents want for us, right? As immigrant parents, you know, they may not have had a certain stability in their home countries, and they're working hard to have that stability for us, and they want to make sure that we have it going forward. But you know, you just have to demonstrate to your parents. And again, this is another quote that I wish I had memorized beforehand, but I think it was John Adams or somebody who said that, you know, certain parents, you know, study, you know, math or science or engineering, or certain parents are farmers, so their kids can study math and science so that their kids can study art and literature and so on and so forth. The idea being that as generations become more stable, you know, maybe you can even pass on a little bit to the future generation financially, and they have a little more wiggle room to do some of the things that, you know, maybe their grandparents couldn't do. I guarantee you, your parents would probably want to do certain things as well that, you know, they couldn't afford to do, that life didn't allow, but they want you to have a life so that, you know, maybe you or your kids can do those things. So just demonstrate seriousness, demonstrate a stable paycheck, and it'll be fine. It won't be easy. My parents still sometimes say, oh, you would have been a good ER doctor. You would have been this or that, or you have good bedside manner. I mean, my mom still brings that stuff up, but it's all in jest.
So if anybody has a question and you want to put it either in the chat box or in the question box, that would be great. One of the students asked, are you planning to run for public office?
In high school, that was, when I say you can't always plan for things, in my mind, I would run for Congress at 25, and Senate at 30, and president at 35. Life doesn't always work out that way, and it's a lot more complicated. But I definitely want to be in public service in some way, whether it's working on Capitol Hill, whether it's working in government, even, something like what Christine's doing. I do want to be part of the conversation. So who knows where life will take you.
The other thing too, keep in mind, didn't Nancy Pelosi start her career like when she was in her late 50s? She has.
Yeah, I think her kids were a little older. She ran for public office. And that's what's great about going into politics. Unlike other countries where, you have to be part of a certain family, or you have to be part of a certain political party's class. In this country, if you're motivated, there is nothing stopping you from running for office, except, the Constitution's age requirements, but otherwise, I think, if you're motivated and you see a problem, go for it.
So Bree, do you have any other questions?
I don't see any questions in the chat box, but Christine, you were mentioning mentors and having those informational interviews and things like that, trying to connect with people. So Mohsen, how important have mentors been kind of throughout your career and helping you kind of guide you, I guess?
Oh, absolutely. No, they've been really important. The funny thing is you might have a mentor and you might not even realize it. My high school teacher, who was our Model UN sponsor, he was amazing. And I don't think I really truly appreciated how much he did for me until I was in college, and just had a better sense to reflect. They're teachers. I've had some wonderful bosses that have looked out for me and have offered me advice. Honestly, I wouldn't be on Capitol Hill if it wasn't for a mentor boss of mine at the Department of Transportation, who I was getting a lot of resistance in terms of doing like a temporary assignment on Capitol Hill. And my boss basically said, no, he really wants to do it. He'd be good for it. Obviously it would be, I'd be sad to see him go, but I know that that's something he wants to do. And he made it happen with my bosses at the Department of Transportation. So no, they've been absolutely everything.
I think one more thing I'm compelled to say on mentors is sometimes your mentors are your colleagues or your friends. I think I would consider Mohsen one of my mentors. He's been remarkable. We've been colleagues, but also in terms of advice and next steps and everything, I would always check with him and talk to him about it. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone older than you.
That's right, yeah.
That's, a peer or a colleague or that you've worked with that can offer you advice too.
Well, thank you for saying that. And
sorry for the background noise.
As Christine knows, I run a lot of this stuff by her too. So, your colleagues, your friends, absolutely.
So another thing, I know a lot of our students, they kind of gravitate or know more about, the majors and studies that everyone kind of knows about. So they might think that, in order to work in government, I have to major in politics or government or history or something like that. I know you said you kind of studied international relations. So what are some other different majors that they can kind of study that might lead them towards?
Well, I was going to say, Christine, you studied urban planning, right? That's
yeah.
People think like, oh no, you only need to study government or politics or history. No, you can really do anything, because I think to be active in government, that sort of community involvement that I mentioned earlier is important too. But just find something that that you like, that you think you could be good at, or that is something that you would enjoy. Study business, study economics, study history, study English. I guarantee you all of that has a place on Capitol Hill, in the White House, in government.
Yeah, I think the diversity of backgrounds is what, just like there's a diversity of opinions needed on Capitol Hill, you can sort of diversity of your backgrounds. I think also, to Mosin's point, working hard and just getting smart. When I came to Capitol Hill, I had no political background, outside of having lived in New Jersey and New York, which is political background itself. But it took a lot of extra work. There's a lot of extra things I had to study and everything, but like, it's never too late. Just because you're not in school anymore doesn't mean you can't research it and understand it and ask people about it and ask questions about it. So that kind of mindset, educational mindset throughout your career and continuing to grow and develop doesn't stop because you're in school.
What other kind of majors, like in Schumer's office, when we came to visit you, they weren't like Allie has, who's communications?
I don't know what her actual major is, but yeah, there's a number of people who work, on Capitol Hill. There's all different types of jobs. There's sort of the more legal chief counsel role. There's things like I did, which was a lot of member engagement. And then there's a whole apparatus on the public affairs and communications and sort of PR side as well. And so there's, but I do think, so yeah, a communications degree, anything in that. I know a number of people who have, that I work with now, who had come from the television world and transitioned into sort of politics and advocacy. There's all across the humanities, right? Everything from philosophy to history and all of those degrees. I did finance, which I think is actually very helpful because there's not that. I think it brings a different opinion to some of the conversations if you've studied actual sort of from a business perspective.
Well, and I was going to say, I'm really impressed by the staffers that I meet who have studied science, the different sciences, and engineering, who are you could argue it's a liberal arts heavy place, but oh my God, they're amazing staffers.
Especially because a lot of what we do is very technical.
Yeah.
Like a lot, there was a hearing yesterday on the topic of spectrum and frequencies in which like GPS and other things take place. And it's an incredibly technical thing that as a staffer, you have to be smart on and understand. And so having that kind of background can really set you apart.
Yeah. And also, don't to that point, like, don't be intimidated. I did not study transportation. My knowledge of transportation started really when I was at a law firm and had a couple of clients in the aerospace industry. And I was in my late 20s by then. So, and here I am doing transportation. So you could argue in many ways, nothing I actually studied in college really applies to what I'm doing. So, again, going back to the theme of what I've been saying, you can't really plan your path. All you can do is, plan to be successful by just working hard and focusing on what's important in life.
Christine, a question for you. And if you could kind of explain a little bit. So someone asked, like, what made you decide going into or majoring in urban planning? Can you explain a little bit more what that is and then why you decided to study that?
Yes. So as I mentioned, I didn't really know much about what urban planning was. I knew I wanted to go to graduate school and I wanted to transition out of finance into something public, more in the public sector. I started going on school websites, every graduate program website, and reading what the alumni did afterwards. And it sounds really dumb or simple. And I went on in the University of Southern California. There was a gentleman who had a job in strategic planning at a port, deciding how big of a port, like what the future of shipping would look like, bringing goods in this country from all over the world and how that fit in the community in Los Angeles. And I was just reading about it. I was like, wow, that's really cool. Never in my life did I know that kind of job existed, that mattered, and that you would do an urban planning degree to do that. And then I went to an interview with the program and applied and everything. And I started reading about the coursework and meeting the professors. And I was like, I love this stuff. This is actually stuff I've been into my whole life, right? Why is that building there? Why is City Hall here? Why does Houston not have a zoning code? So it was a very backwards approach, but I think that's sometimes how you kind of back into it, or just sort of read about it and stumble into things you never knew existed. And my parents might be able to weigh in there too. I don't know if you guys quite knew what urban planning was prior to me studying.
True.
I think that's a good point, saying how you kind of went backwards. It's funny because Katie mentioned that last week, actually, when we were speaking with our college students about sometimes it's good to do exactly what you did and kind of see what alumni are doing and then kind of work backwards that way. And kind of that would be a great way to kind of get mentorships and different things like that.
Do you have any other questions?
No, I don't believe so. None left.
If any of the folks on the phone too want to talk, I don't, at least from my perspective, or follow up and talk about DC or what specific people and jobs and stuff, I'm always here as a resource and happy to do that.
Absolutely. Don't hesitate. If there's any questions I can answer offline too. Happy to do so.
Well, thank y'all very, very much. Really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're very, very busy. You've got lots going on. So I really appreciate you joining us today. And for those that are haven't signed into the chat box, make sure you write your name and your school before you leave. And with that, we'll say thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you, guys.